My name is Lori Gagan, and today I'm joined by Jessica Endicott, my beautiful, lovely colleague, and Kathleen Halal will also be joining us here shortly. But today we'll be interviewing Dr. Brian Moench. Dr. Brian Moench and his group of physicians, known as Utah Physicians for a Healthier Environment, really monitor what's going on in the Great Salt Lake. And Jessica, I have to tell you, Jim and I met Dr. Brian a couple of weeks ago, and I didn't know that it was so important in the lake, not only to the marine life, to really what's going on with the communities. And when he told me what was happening in the lake as far as for drying up in the soot, but it came with all of the arsenic, the cadmium, the lead, the glyphosate that's drying up in the soot. And unfortunately, when we have the wind blowing, then all of these toxins are blowing into the communities surrounding the Great Salt Lake. But I mean, people come from all over the world to look at the Great Salt Lake. That's how important. It's one of the most important lakes in the West, which I've never done a lot of research on it. I mean, I've always driven it by it. It's beautiful. And you live pretty close to it as well.
Yep. And I've played in it many times. We used to go boating out there as a child too. So it's really close to my heart, dear to my heart and my
Well,
family.
unfortunately, I guess we shouldn't be boating or swimming it in anymore. But before we bring Dr. Brian Moench in, um, let's go ahead and why don't you talk about our mission, and then I'll read the disclaimers, and then we'll introduce Dr. Brian Moench.
Awesome. Yep. Okay, so our mission statement. Our mission is to educate and empower you to make informed choices for your health, the health of our children, our communities, and our earth. We're committed to fostering a world where the balance between human health and environmental stewardship is respected and nurtured. Join us in this holistic and transformative journey as we work together to create a healthier, more harmonious world for all. Please join the crusade.
Awesome. And before I read the disclaimers, if anybody is watching opposed to hearing, I'm out in Arizona in a Sprinter camping van, so it's my first time. So if I lose connection, Jess, you'll just have to take over and I'll join as quickly as possible. So, the disclaimers, the listener understands that the role of the certified health coach is not to prescribe or assess micro and macronutrient levels, to provide healthcare, medical, or nutrition therapy services, or to diagnose, treat, or cure any disease, condition, or other physical, mental ailments of the human body. Rather, the coach is a mentor and a guide who has been trained and certified in holistic health coaching to help clients achieve positive and sustainable lifestyle changes. We are not acting in the capacity of a doctor, a licensed dietitian, a licensed nutritionist, a psychologist, or any other licensed or registered professional. And that advice given by the coach is not meant to take is not meant to take the place or the advice of these professionals. We are not acting in the capacity of a doctor, a licensed dietitian, or any of the licensed professionals. The listener understands that the information mentioned in our talks should not be seen as medical or nursing advice and is not meant to see the place of seeing a licensed health care professional. And if any of our listeners are on any type of prescription medications, we ask that you do not discontinue these medications without first consulting his or her doctor. So, with that said, from the cockpit of the Sprinter, and there's our lovely colleague, co host, Kathleen Halal.
Hi,
We are
everyone.
just about to bring Dr. Brian Moench in, and if you recall, Dr. Brian Moench was helping the dad and the daughter um, out in Nephi, and about a month ago, I went and I interviewed that family who their lives have been devastated by the spraying of glyphosate and other herbicides, as well as what is going on with the mosquito abatement issue and all of the chemicals that are being used and sprayed, not only in the state of Utah, but literally all across the world. And I often refer to it, just like Elaine does, as chemical rape. So we're going to bring in Leighton, if you can bring in Dr. Brian Moench. We'll get started. Kathleen, I've got some questions. Please feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. Good afternoon, Dr. Brian Moench. We are honored to have you, and thank you for your time today to get your much needed, very important information out in what you are doing with the Great Salt Lake, and also trying to, you know, help all of the citizens that live in the state of Utah. So we welcome you today. So why don't you tell us a little bit, give us an overview of how you got started in what you did with your group.
Well, thanks for having me. And let me tell you a little bit about the formation of our group. We organized our physicians group back in 2007 with a handful, eight specifically, eight physicians who, many of whom were colleagues of mine, and we were very concerned about the levels of air pollution in the state of Utah. And we realized back in 2007, even we didn't know all that much about what air pollution does to human health. So we decided that we'd have to study it on our own. And now I will say I've got a lot of background noise. I don't know if the rest of you have background noise or not, but I can hear
it.
That's better. That's a lot better. So we realized that not only we weren't all that well educated in what air pollution does to human health, but most of our colleagues weren't either. In fact, the more we realized that even though some of us had some real significant specialties in human health, hardly any of us had real training or real education in what air pollution did. So we formed an ad hoc study group back in 2007, and we decided we were going to educate ourselves. We reconvened about 2 months later, and we universally said to ourselves, what we found was really alarming. So we called up the governor's office, John Huntsman at the time, and we said, I don't think you or your administration has any idea what air pollution is really doing to people, and we need to meet with you. So in a couple of weeks, Governor Huntsman agreed to meet with us, and he said, I'll give you 25 minutes to tell me what we need to know. He ended up spending an hour and a half with us and ended up making air pollution one of the top 3 issues of his administration. From there, we've grown from 8 physicians into one of the largest physicians organizations in the Western United States, now having about 450 physicians that are members and supporters, and about 3,000 members of the lay public. Our initial focus was on air pollution, but we have expanded the issues that we're engaged in to include things like chemical contamination of our food supply, of our air and our water, issues like microplastics and how ubiquitous they have become in our environment. So everything that's going on now with the Great Salt Lake in terms of it becoming an increasing health hazard to the heavily populated areas of the Wasatch Front fits very closely into our mission statement, which is essentially to try and improve the overall state of the environment and therefore public health, not only in the state of Utah, but in the Western United States. And in fact, over the last 17 years, we've had numerous states reach out to us, numerous groups reach out to us, and we've consulted with them on projects like trying to reduce pollution from industrial sources, prevent the formation of mines near urban areas. We've helped cities in California that have been fighting pollution from asphalt plants. We've actually also helped people as far away as Australia and British Columbia fight various sorts of pollution battles.
Wow.
We became even more interested in the issue of chemical contamination of our environment when one of our supporters about 3 years ago alerted us to the fact that the Salt Lake City Mosquito Abatement District was proposing to use the United States Air Force to spray pesticides over the northwest quadrant of Salt Lake City. Now, we weren't experts in pesticides at that particular time, but we said, wait a minute, that doesn't really sound very good.
No.
So we decided, amongst the other things that we needed to become a lot more expert in, what do pesticides do to human health? And after several months of study, we put out about a 63-page report on what we thought were the health hazards of this practice, referenced by about 350 articles for the medical literature. And this has become one of our most important issues.
And it's very important. And I'm going to throw out a couple of times during this talk, because we'll have listeners in and out, that Dr. Brian, can you just tell our listeners the name of the website? And I want to bring this up several times because I know that you're a nonprofit, and your group also needs the help of the community of the state, really, to kind of help you battle what you're battling. I know that when my husband Jim and I came in, we wanted to do our own personal donation because we know that it's expensive to do what you are doing. So I think that that's important that we periodically on this podcast get that out so that we can drive as many people as we can. So your website again, can you, just so it's coming from you, is?
uphe.org. UPHE is the acronym for Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment.
Okay, and Leighton just put it up on the screen. So for the viewers watching, this is where you can go. You can help donate. Dr. Brian, are there things that, besides from a monetary donation, and I always say that any donation, a $5 or a $10 donation, helps causes like this. Do you also look at people in the community to spread the word on what you're doing?
Oh, absolutely. Part of our goal, in fact, we have a little slogan. We educate, we advocate, and when necessary, we litigate. And all of those things do require money. We think that educating the public is critical to getting better public policy. Active advocacy for legislation that improves our environment is important. But I'll be honest, we've found that in the last few years, our willingness to actually file lawsuits to force better government policy, both at the state level and the federal level, are absolutely critical in actually achieving improved public policy. So all three of those avenues are important, and they all take time. They all take money. We have a very small staff, hardly, I would say, the amount of money that we spend on a staff is far less than what you would think. And now we're actually trying to raise money to further our efforts in the courts to save the Great Salt Lake, in particular, save the population of the Wasatch Front from what we think is a looming environmental disaster. And I like to say, whenever there's an environmental disaster, if you wait long enough or look hard enough, you will find a public health disaster. And that's exactly what we're worried about with the disappearance of the Great Salt Lake. So there are a lot of different aspects to the toxic profile of looming dust from a shrinking Great Salt Lake. I hope we have a chance to get into some of the specifics.
Yeah.
But suffice it to say that dust in and of itself, without any chemical contaminants, is a health hazard when it's inhaled.
Can you start at the beginning with that, please? With the beginning of the story of what's going on with the Great Salt Lake, so that people, maybe not everyone knows, and then what the hazards are that we may be facing down the road if nothing is done, and what kinds of things could be done. Could you please?
The surface area of the Great Salt Lake has shrunk by about 60% in the last several decades. What that has left behind are obviously dry beaches. And depending on the particular site within the overall Great Salt Lake ecosystem, some of those sites can become significant sources of dust whenever the wind blows more than about 10 miles an hour. About 15 years ago, meteorologists were not really seeing any significant dust episodes generated from the Great Salt Lake, but now we're seeing on average about 15 dust storms per year. So if we allow through misguided public policy the lake to continue to shrivel up, those 15 dust storms a year are going to turn into 20, 25, 30, and they're going to be bigger. And they're going to affect a much greater population. Right now, the most affected populations are probably the people in Davis County and Weber County and probably North Salt Lake. But if the lake is allowed to continue to shrivel up, those dust storms will become more significant, and a much greater portion of the population on the Wasatch Front will be affected.
And Dr. Brian, what are you in the soot of what's drying up? What type of pesticides, herbicides, and heavy metals? I mean, I've read a lot on your website already, but what are you finding in there? The toxic chemicals?
Well, a lot of the use of herbicides and insecticides is well-meaning, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have some significant public health hazard to it. Multiple entities, state agencies, for example, and other groups are using glyphosate, Roundup, to try and kill invasive Phragmites species on the shore of the Great Salt Lake. Now, there's value in getting rid of those invasive species. They really are destructive to duck habitat. They're very water intensive, or I should say they're very aggressive consumers of water. So for a lot of ecological reasons, it's valuable to get rid as much as possible of these invasive Phragmites species. But if what's required to do that involves plastering that area with herbicides like Roundup, then it seems as though whoever's making this decision is not taking into account the other side of the ledger. Now, you could say almost the exact same thing about the use of mosquito abatement pesticides, which, you know, kind of got our involvement in this issue right from the beginning. There are two categories of insecticides that are most often used throughout the country and in Salt Lake. One is organophosphates, and another is pyrethroids. Organophosphates are usually sprayed by airplanes or drones, or helicopters, things like that. It's actually too toxic for people to be using that, to be spraying them from trucks and from backpacks. So in that sort of application, they use a category of chemicals called pyrethroids. But the amount of medical research now that shows even small exposure to these kinds of chemicals is just overwhelming. So what our frustration is that some of these environmental pursuits are worthy pursuits, but nobody's taking into account the public health consequences of multiple types of chemicals being sprayed in the same area. And we all know that this spraying gets throughout the Great Salt Lake ecosystem and contaminates the environment where most of the people live. We know, in fact, that pesticides sprayed in one continent can appear in an entirely different continent 5 to 6 days later. So no one can say that, oh, we're just spraying it over an area that's uninhabited, so it's not a big problem. That's not how this works. We now know from multiple tests that from the top of Mount Everest to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, which is the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean, from the hairs on polar bears in the Arctic to the nuclei in the cells, brain cells of newborn babies in the United States, all of that is contaminated with toxic chemicals, especially pesticides. Glyphosate in particular is so ubiquitous in our environment because it is used relentlessly in the Midwest. It's now present in the air we breathe, the water we drink, and rainfall that comes from the sky. So anyone who has the idea that it's okay for us to continue to pour pesticides like this into our environment, especially in this kind of proximity to 2.5 million people, doesn't understand the hazards of what they're doing.
Yeah, so can you help us to understand those hazards of what happens to our body and our mind when we're exposed to those chemicals?
And Dr. Brian, I'll elaborate on what Jess just said just a little bit more. Because of what our group does, we know the dangers of how these chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, heavy metals, however they're spraying them, we see the uptick in the health of humans. We see the uptick right now in mental health. We know that there is a disconnect with some of the conventional medicine doctors who really aren't doing deep dive researches like you. Um, so that when people walk in to their office and they are not feeling good, their immune system is compromised, but they're not getting to root cause. They're not getting to all of the stuff that you're talking about and all of the things that we're trying to do behind the scenes, from the soil, which is really dirt when these farmers are spraying, and even the surrounding areas of the Great Salt Lake and how it impacts the immune health. So when you're explaining that from a medical doctor perspective, your group sees patients. What are you also seeing in there that could be part of the root cause?
No one can say that a particular disease that a person has is necessarily attributable to a certain kind of environmental exposure. For example, when somebody comes into the emergency room, has a heart attack, and dies of that heart attack, we can't say exactly what did it. We know that air pollution contributes to events like that, contributes to strokes. But nobody ends up in the morgue with a toe tag that says air pollution did this. Well, the same is true of chemical toxins. No one can say that a certain person's birth defect or a certain person's case of cancer was due to some sort of chemical exposure. But what we can say is there are all kinds of studies that show, epidemiologic studies, for example, that show populations exposed to more of these chemicals show higher rates of various kinds of diseases. Let me just share with you a quote, and I'm going to ask you to guess when this quote was made. For the first time in the history of the world, every human being is now subjected to contact with dangerous chemicals from the moment of conception until death. These chemicals are now stored in the bodies of the vast majority of human beings, regardless of age. They occur in mother's milk and probably in the tissues of unborn children. Take a guess who said that and when they said it.
I'm afraid to answer that.
That was Rachel Carson in 1962. We are now 60 plus years after that fact, and it seems like we have learned virtually nothing.
Yep.
Right now, chemical manufacturers are producing about 140 industrial chemicals. About 10% are known to be carcinogenic. The average person now is exposed to about 100 times more chemicals than just 2 generations ago. The United States alone imports or manufactures 52 billion pounds of chemicals every day. Common fruits and vegetables are contaminated with up to 60 different pesticides.
Wow.
And the indoor air of the average person's home harbors about 400 different chemicals. Researchers in Texas did 300 samples from 31 different types of food in Dallas, Texas, and they found every single one showed multiple pesticides. So from the food we eat, from the air we breathe, and the water we drink, we're literally changing who human beings are because we have allowed them to become chemical junkyards. I put it this way, we're essentially all human guinea pigs in a massive toxicology experiment that we didn't consent to, that has no scientific design or constraints, and is conducted by people who have little to no concern about how the experiment will affect your health and your life. The average person now excretes over 2,200 chemicals in their urine every single day.
Wow.
Over 80% of us,
2002 chemicals? That's crazy.
2,200 chemicals in their urine every single day. 80% of us are excreting glyphosate in our urine every single day in concentrations higher than the drinking water standards in Europe. Now, most concerning is from what I've just kind of described, now you have to start thinking about, well, what is happening to the development of children in their mother's wombs? Here's a very disconcerting thought. Newborns are basically born pre-polluted. We know hundreds of these chemicals can cross the placenta, through the umbilical cord and interfere with the organ formation of fetuses. So by the time a newborn is delivered on day one, in their blood and all their tissues are hundreds of chemicals that we know are toxic. That's a moral failure. And any sort of policy that makes this situation worse needs to be looked at as a moral failure. Nursing infants consume sometimes 10 to 20 times more things like dioxins than the average adult does. It only takes like 6 months of a breastfeeding infant to have from her mother transferred 20% of the mother's lifetime accumulation of very toxic chemicals like dioxins. So even once they're born, a nursing child is still getting an overload of toxic chemicals from the mother's milk. That, in and of itself, is a moral failure.
Oh my gosh, the numbers are staggering. When you're educating patients at any of your doctors, are you getting good responses from these moms?
Well, most people just don't know. Most people are not aware.
Right.
When I give a lecture to an audience, I show them pictures of autopsies where we know that these air pollution particles have penetrated virtually every cell of every critical organ they have. That microplastics, nanoplastic particles are now basically setting up shop in all of our critical organs. And we're all exposed to it like that. And like I said, almost from the moment of conception, that's what's happening. So I'm actually surprised that there isn't more of an overall health burden than what we're seeing. But I'll just give you a personal example. The family next door to me to the south, the father has an aggressive bloodborne cancer being kept alive by an experimental drug. His daughter died of brain cancer at age 40. Right next door to him, the father has bladder cancer and has had his bladder removed. Fortunately, he's still alive. His wife recently had a mastectomy for breast cancer. In the other direction, my next door neighbor has Parkinson's disease. 2 houses away, my neighbor just got operated on for brain cancer. His son died of a brain cancer at age 35. My niece just passed away from ovarian cancer at age 55.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Now, these are all anecdotes, But we know that about 80 to 90% of cancer is environmentally caused. Now, I should be a little more specific about that, because what you eat, what you inhale, what you might smoke is all your personal environment. What's not your personal environment is your genetic profile. But genetics only accounts for maybe 10 to 15% of your overall cancer risk. So what we're doing to our environment has real consequences. Like I say, I can't say which neighbor got their cancer from a particular environmental exposure, but we can say people exposed to more of these things have these kinds of outcomes. So there are real personal tragedies involved here, even though we can't say specifically who are the specific victims.
Well, I want to say that my specific concern is childhood development, because we're in big trouble. You know, my mom was a teacher, my sister's a teacher of elementary school, and when my kids were young, you know, they had autoimmune issues, which we were handling a lot through discovering diet, eating clean, eating organic food, speaking with farmers, and finding out that Roundup was plastered everywhere and that we should avoid those kinds of foods that have a lot of pesticides. But working in the classrooms and volunteering with the PTA and the parents groups, I couldn't help but notice the extreme increase in the number of children that have, you know, ADHD, or they're on the spectrum, or they have food allergies. And now there are children being born who have such severe food allergies they can't eat anything. You know, none of this existed when we were young. None of it. It's just skyrocketing. And for the children, for our future, I'm really concerned that people aren't paying much attention to this. And I'm grateful to you, Doctor, for standing up. And
Well, I'm glad you brought up the issue of neurotoxicity, because the second book that I wrote is called The Great Brain Robbery: Why Women Have Become Smarter Than Men, Science with an Attitude. And the premise of the book is based on what I started noticing about 10 years ago in the research on environmental neurotoxins. And by that, we're talking about heavy metals, we're talking about pesticides, we're talking about fluoride, we're talking about radioactive isotopes. What I noticed is in those studies where there was a distinction made between genders, between males and females, almost invariably, these environmental toxins had a more profound effect on males than they did on females. So I started diving into that subject matter, and it turns out that estrogen is very brain protective. And one of the reasons why males are more profoundly affected by most of these environmental toxins is they don't produce as much estrogen, obviously. But if you look at the rates of autism, for example, they're about 4 to 5 times the rate in males compared to females. There's a similar, but not exactly the same ratio in attention deficit disorder. So if you look at these studies that show impact on brain development and all these environmental influences that are harming males more than females, you might think, well, yeah, we're kind of seeing the manifestation of that in rates of autism and attention deficit disorder, but it's actually much more than that. We now know through studies throughout the world that women are performing better than men academically, on IQ tests, on memory tests, almost throughout every sort of metric of brain function. Women are now exceeding the performance of men. And my premise is that that's at least in somewhat due to the fact that we're allowing this proliferation of neurotoxins in our environment where males are being affected more than females. So let's take autism spectrum disorder. About 30 years ago, it was diagnosed about 1 in every 10,000 children. Now it's being diagnosed 1 in every 32 Utah boys.
one in 22 California boys.
Well, Utah used to have the highest rates in the country. We kind of went back and forth with New Jersey. Now, a lot of apologists will say, well, that's because autism is being diagnosed more readily because people are more aware.
No.
You show me the parent 40 years ago that was not aware of whether or not their developing child was developing normally. That's absurd. Now, some of that may be, quote, overdiagnosis, but not going from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 30 or 1 in 22. That's not because of overdiagnosis. It's a real phenomenon. And we know from studies like from Stanford University, about 2/3 of the risk of autism is from environmental exposures.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a third may be genetic, and genetic includes the differences between male and female in their production of things like glutathione, which is the body's best heavy metals detoxifier. Mm-hmm. But we see all kinds of studies that show pregnant mothers exposed to more pesticides will have a higher risk that their child will be autistic. Yeah. Will have a higher risk that their child will have a decreased IQ at age 6, 7, 8, or 9. So those are just a few examples of multiple studies from every stage of development that show environmental neurotoxins are having a profound effect on people's ability to think, their memory, their cognitive function, their emotional behavior, and things like that. And almost across the board, males are being impacted more than females.
Also, the sperm count.
Sperm counts have dropped globally about 50% in the last 30 to 35 years. Now, we don't know exactly why, but again, almost certainly environmental toxins are responsible for that. We don't know exactly which ones. And the end result is that infertility is becoming an increasingly significant problem, especially in the developed world.
Dr. Brian, are there any ongoing efforts or initiatives to mitigate pesticide contamination in the Great Salt Lake?
I will say I'm starting to get that background waterfall noise again, so I'm having a little hard time hearing. Repeat that question for me.
Are there any ongoing efforts or initiatives to mitigate pesticide contamination in the Great Salt Lakes?
Well, our group is about the only one involved in trying to persuade state officials to start backing off from this. And now there are a few other people that have recognized the issue, one of whom, for instance, is a landholder on the shores of the Utah Lake. And he has a problem with invasive Phragmites, similar to what I just described a few minutes ago. But he showed me pictures of parts of his property that he put cattle to graze and eat the Phragmites, compared to a part that was sprayed with glyphosate. 3 months after the fact, the Phragmites where the cattle grazed were about this tall. The Phragmites that were sprayed with glyphosate were like 3 to 4 feet.
Yeah, it's not working.
Well, it's obviously not working, but we know that the entire biological world, insects and plants, develop resistance to these chemicals. And that's plaguing farmers in the Midwest now. And the end result is a chemical arms race gets initiated. So now they're moving to things that are actually even more toxic than glyphosate, like 2,4-D and dicamba. And so these biotech companies are developing crops that are resistant to dicamba and 2,4-D that were kind of put on the shelf 40 years ago because they were too toxic, but now they're resurrecting them because the glyphosate is no longer working.
Yeah, but it's glyphosate. It's in their tanks. They're mixing the glyphosate with the dicamba, with the 2,4-D, with other chemicals. Now it's a blend. They're not dropping the glyphosate. That's
right. And let me tell you, with regard to the idea of mixing those kinds of chemicals, when the EPA supposedly studies the toxicity of these chemicals, they don't study mixtures. They only study them one at a time. And that's one of the serious flaws with the EPA's toxicology risk assessments is no one's exposed to one toxin at a time. No one's exposed to even one pesticide at a time. So when the EPA isolates the situations in laboratory animals and says, well, laboratory animals exposed to this particular pesticide show this kind of an outcome, there's nobody on earth whose circumstance mirrors that study because we're all exposed to mixes of all of these kinds of things. So that's just one of the many problems about trying to anticipate what these mixtures do when in fact they're just not studied that way. And it should be pointed out that we know from some studies that the effects are not just additive, but synergistic, meaning there's a multiplier effect.
So, Dr. Brian, when you go for litigation and to court and to, be speaking with the House, wherever you're doing your talks, what are you hearing from the opposite party that you're trying to make the statement and get that through their head that it is causing damage not only to the Great Salt Lake but to human health? What are they saying? Are they just like ignoring it, or are they saying that studies lack? And
Here,
in it,
that's a good question.
well, because when we got involved with Blaine and his daughter in Nephi, and we went out there and I did an interview with Leighton actually, and I emailed the people at the town hall, they basically came in and told me in an email that they've done all of their due diligence, all of the research, and they couldn't find any studies warranting it, that it had caused any damage to Blaine's daughter, which we all know is false.
Well, this is where it really gets discouraging how the EPA has behaved here. Invariably, the most common response that we get from, say, an employee of a state agency who wants to try and portray what they're doing as totally benign, they will say, "Oh, this has been approved by the EPA." Well, the EPA. I think you need to understand how the EPA ever even got off the ground and their regulation of chemicals ever started, and that was in the early 1970s when I think it was 1976 they passed the first act that ever addressed toxic pesticides. At that time, there were about 62,000 chemicals that 62,000 industrial chemicals that were on the market. So the EPA said, right from the initiation of the EPA's attempt to regulate this, we're going to grandfather all of those 62,000 chemicals in, and we're not going to test them.
Wow.
And unless the manufacturer has some information that is going to cause us an alarm. Now, what kind of a manufacturer is going to volunteer, oh, my chemical's toxic, so I need to be tested? Nobody volunteered for that. Do you know how many chemicals the EPA has tested in their entire life? Take a guess.
I know it's a low amount. Less than 10%.
I told you, I think earlier, that there are now about 140,000 different industrial chemicals in production. The EPA has tested 200 of 140,000 chemicals. Do you know how many they've actually banned? Take
Under
a while.
10?
Under 10. Under 10. And it doesn't even include things like asbestos. They've kind of phased it out, but not entirely banned it. So the idea that the EPA is protecting us and making sure that these kinds of chemicals are not hazardous to human health reflects a complete misunderstanding of the regulatory strength, power, and commitment that the EPA has, which is unfortunately not an awful lot. I have personally, in fact, our doctors group personally met with the chemical division of the EPA a couple of years ago, complaining about all this. I have to say, I was stunned at how much they did not care, how much they did not really want to try and rebut anything we said. They just basically listened and blew us off. Now, there have been books and multiple investigative articles written about the EPA's cozy relationship with the chemical manufacturers. And we don't have time to delve into all of that, but it's basically the chemical manufacturing industry has captured the regulatory capability of the EPA in their favor. And the protection of public health, at least in terms of exposure to chemical toxins in our environment, is almost non-existent. So when I hear state employees say, well, the EPA has approved this, they have no idea about the role of the EPA and what they don't do.
And that's exactly what Nephi said, that if the EPA and Utah is saying that something is safe, then why would they sometimes give it to them for free if the EPA has stated it's safe and Utah has stated it's safe? Because I know they give a lot of those products away, like out in American Fork, to the farmers, the 2,4-D and the glyphosate. And so it's free. And when you go up against having to go out and buy a non-toxic product, that's where the problem comes in. It's poison, which is free, or something non-toxic organic, which is not free. My comment to them is always like, what's the price of cancer cost you? Because I know several farmers who have non-Hodgkin's and they're still going to American Fork to get their free herbicide.
Well, here's another dimension to what I just described about the far too cozy relationship between pesticide manufacturers and the EPA. And that is the far too cozy relationship between the chemical industry and academic institutions. Land grant institutions throughout the country have slowly been becoming more and more dependent on donations from big agriculture and from the chemical industry in particular, say like companies like Monsanto, like Bayer, like Syngenta. They will donate enough to, say, an institution like Utah State University, one of these land grant institutions, such that that particular department then becomes dependent on the donations of these corporations. Mm. So you would be just extremely naive if you thought that that doesn't steer the research by those departments, as well as determine who gets tenure within those departments. If you have a researcher whose research is really independent and says, wait a minute, this particular pesticide really is toxic, what invariably happens is the manufacturer comes in and puts pressure on that institution to silence, squelch, and in some cases, fire that researcher.
Wow.
So it isn't just government agencies that have been taken over by corporations. Their influence also extends into things that we think are protected from that, and that is our institutions of higher learning.
Okay, that's like crazy. You know what? I'm gonna hey Leighton, can you put the call-in number up? I've got a couple of text questions, but for those listeners who want to call in and speak with Dr. Brian Moench, the number is 385-899-2134. We are going to open this up for callers in about 5 to 10 minutes. But for those of you that are just joining us, Dr. Brian, again, can you tell our listeners again about your website? And basically what I want to say to the listeners out there is that Dr. Brian's group can't fight this alone. They need help. They need the help of every single listener on this call. Any type of monetary donations helps. A $5, a $10 donation. I normally don't put that out there, but I know what it costs to run in litigation, especially, I, I'm just going to say this myself, especially when you are fighting about with corrupt governments, not just in Utah, but worldwide, the United States, all over the world, that Dr. Brian's group needs help, and they need help from each and every one of us, especially for everybody living in the state of Utah, because there is no one that can live in a bubble that is not going to be compromised. Their immune system, their health, their grandparents, their children, their grandchildren. We're all susceptible. So can you just, again, just repeat your website? Again, that call-in number is 385-899-2134. And then, Dr. Brian, after you say that, can you also, as we're wrapping this up, can you also tell us about the bill that was passed with the new mine that the state of Utah just allowed? Not that Parley's isn't creating enough toxic dust and dirt for us, that's also harming people up at Little Cotton. I know that there's an ongoing fight on that, and I think that's equally important to get that out because so many people do not know about that.
Well, thank you for that. And I just want to say, when we arranged to do this, I did not ask Laurie to make that pitch for donations. So I'm all the more grateful that she did that. And I will want to reiterate that when we try and persuade lawmakers or state or federal officials that, hey, what you're allowing is really a health hazard, almost invariably that doesn't work very well. And so what we have found in the last few years that we are getting the most success in terms of stopping projects that are environmentally unsound or improving overall public policy is through the court system. So our ability to file lawsuits when the state or the federal government are not doing their job is becoming increasingly critical to trying to protect people's health. Now, I'm glad you brought up the mine because this is a perfect example of a bullying corporation, this time from California, who's trying to actually just make a profit here in Utah at the expense of everyone here. Their proposal, they have filed they have filed an application with the Division of Air Quality to carve what would ultimately a mine of 632 acres of a combined limestone quarry gravel pit. And to put that in context, that's about 1/3 the size of the Bingham Canyon copper mine in the Ochre Mountains. And the location would be about 2 miles from the mouth of the canyon. So it would be a monstrosity in terms of a gravel pit, limestone quarry. It would tear up the natural canyon, the aesthetics of it. It would destroy it as a function of a refuge for wildlife. It would threaten the water. It would be an increased risk for wildfires. These things are always constant sources of air pollution and fugitive dust. But Granite Construction, a corporation in California, doesn't care about any of that. They see our Utah's weak mining laws, and they're determined to go after that. So our group and several other environmental groups are fighting that permit. Whenever it's announced, and we expect that'll be in the next month or so, we're going to be in court virtually the next day challenging that permit. Salt Lake County will challenge it. Salt Lake City will challenge it on the basis of they don't want to give them water to function, to operate the mine. Salt Lake County is going to challenge it on the basis of land use authority. But we're the only ones who are going to be able to challenge it on the basis of it violates the state and local air quality standards. So the point being that there's a particular example where state regulations are insufficient to protect us from what virtually everybody thinks would be a huge mistake. I don't know anybody who drives up and down Parley's Canyon and thinks, boy, what we need there is a massive mine to destroy that canyon. Nobody thinks that. But that's what's going to happen unless we're
And
able
it's
to prevent
ugly.
it in the courts. Well, it's hideous. It's a tremendous source of water consumption, water contamination. It will affect the vegetation in the canyon far beyond the mine itself, because as dust settles on vegetation, that stresses the vegetation itself. And when we're in a drought, the last thing that trees in a forest need is have dust settle on their pine needles or their leaves and make their water demands even that much greater. So the impact on the vegetation in the canyon will go far beyond just the mine itself. That's just one of many issues.
Who is arguing for this mining operation to come in? I mean, I know that Utah's water issues are quite serious. I'm surprised.
Oh,
I'm surprised it's not just a non-starter.
Well, it shouldn't be. It should be a non-starter for every single reason that you can think of, including water consumption. We had a BYU professor try and estimate how much water consumption the mine that big would be using to try and tamp down in a vain effort to try and tamp down that fugitive dust. And it's somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million gallons per year per acre. So it's an enormous water hog, not to mention that, we're talking about contaminants of dust that we might inhale that lands on vegetation. There are 2 main reservoirs in Parley's Canyon that provide drinking water to the Salt Lake Valley. And if you allow dust to perpetually drift over those reservoirs, that dust settles in the reservoirs and slowly contaminates that water. So that's another issue.
Right. So they're taking our essential drinking water and they're watering down the dirt to keep the dust from flying.
But it never works. I mean, you've all driven by gravel pits, like at the point of the mountain, like in North Salt Lake. It's almost a futile effort to try and tamp down that dust. And here's one of the best parts. State regulations don't hold them accountable for dust suppression if the wind speeds are above 25 miles an hour. And in Parley's Canyon, that's the case 40% of the time.
Wow.
So that's just a glaring example in my backyard of the inadequacy of state regulatory authority to protect the public from something that's so obviously disconnected from what the public wants and what the public needs in terms of health protection.
Okay. I think we have a caller for you, Dr. Brian. Leighton, do you want to bring him in?
All right, let me bring them on in here. All right, I have Shelly Marcus. They are local here to Utah. Shelly, you are live with the Wellness Crusaders. What question do you have for them today?
I wonder what we can do so that we don't have all this spraying going on continually in our communities and out in the areas of the state of Utah, because they're spraying multiple times. We have spraying done by people, spraying done by cities, state, school, federal, county, and they just keep doing it. They don't coordinate anything. They're spraying everything multiple times, and we shouldn't even be spraying at all, especially when people are present, walking down streets or with their families, or driving in their cars. We're spraying everything. Shouldn't have a need to spray it all. There are better ways to do it.
Well, in my virtual backyard, which is Mill Creek Canyon, somebody called me yesterday and said that the Department of Natural Resources is spraying glyphosate in Mill Creek Canyon via drones.
No.
And when I found out about that, I just became apoplectic.
Oh, that's horrible.
But
Nope.
illustrating what illustrating what the caller just called about, which is these people have such little understanding of the toxicity of these chemicals that they're not warning the public. They're not trying to get the public out of the way. There have been studies in Japan from the 50s and 60s that show that children exposed to agricultural pesticides through drifting have what's called now a Saku eye disease, where over 90% of the children in that area affected in Japan have a deterioration of their eyes because of drifting pesticides from agricultural applications. So the idea that people don't need to take any sort of precaution if they're going to have spraying of chemicals overhead is absolutely nuts. So anyway, having just learned what they're doing in Mill Creek Canyon, that's going to be another battle that we're going to be facing here in the next couple of weeks.
Doctor, there are also the studies in Argentina of all the children that are near the GMO crops.
Right.
Mostly
Well,
Roundup, but also other chemicals, and terrible health effects on those children. I mean, there are so many studies, and I feel like the one thing that people don't understand is that when people kind of take issue with the counties or whoever's deciding to spray these pesticides, the decision makers are saying, well, the EPA said this is okay. But nobody knows, nobody clearly understands what the EPA does. The EPA never decides whether something is safe or unsafe. They make economics decisions. It's a financial decision, and they weigh the economic benefit of the U.S. economy versus potential harms. And they accept the science that's submitted from the companies themselves to make those decisions. So they're not looking at the full science, and they're considering the economic benefit. And that's why many of these chemicals have been approved, such as glyphosate. Really, they should be looked at much harder. But people tend to have faith in the EPA, and they say, well, if the EPA allows it, then it's okay to use. But it might not be.
Well, I think it's an excuse that they use to do it. I'm not sure that they're convinced that the EPA is actually exonerating these chemicals, but they do use it as an excuse. You mentioned what's gone on in Argentina. Let me tell you what's gone on in Brazil. When glyphosate was introduced to the soybean production area in Brazil, and obviously some of that glyphosate was now getting into the water supply in a city downstream from these agricultural areas that had just introduced glyphosate. In other words, they weren't directly exposed, but only through contamination of the stream that ran through. And then that the city downstream depended on that for their water supply, a city of about 500,000. They saw within a year a spike in infant deaths, to the point where researchers estimated that in this one city of 500,000 people, glyphosate was probably responsible for 550 infant deaths just from the introduction of glyphosate as part of the GMO soybean system that has been marketed throughout the world. I wanted to say one other thing. About 15% of the adult population, in at least in the United States and probably globally, has what we might term multiple chemical sensitivity syndrome. That means that those people are affected acutely, symptomatically from exposure to chemicals that may not affect most people. And the way I know this is my wife has it. If there's any sort of chemical in the house, whether it's, say, a paint cleaner, a paint thinner, a pesticide, I can't smell it, but my wife instantly can, and she gets a headache. And it has to be immediately removed from it. So with that kind of personal experience, I kind of investigated this issue, and this sort of problem affects probably 15% of the population. The most common trigger of this disorder is pesticide exposure. And when you interview these people and say, what was the exposure that started this whole thing for you? 60% of them say it was a pesticide exposure. So it isn't just the impact on children. It isn't just the chronic exposure that can lead to cancer and all these other disorders. It can be an acute assault on a person's health, even if they're otherwise healthy.
That's just crazy. Hey, Leighton, is the caller still on, or is there another caller?
We still have Blaine on the line if he has any more questions for you.
Okay, can you?
It just seems like that that people, when they go in for help to the doctor, they don't recognize it either, because it's so much more prevalent now than it was before, and they don't know what they're dealing with. The people don't know that they've been seriously exposed to it because nobody tells them.
Well, I think that speaks to the inadequacy of the medical education system, quite frankly. When I was in medical school in the 70s, we basically had no course instruction on what environmental toxins do to public health. That's almost still the same, the way now what we're talking about almost 50 years later. And I'll give you another little anecdote. I gave the first ever lecture to the University of Utah Medical School on environmental neurotoxins during the pandemic. So that's gradually changing, but not fast enough. The bottom line is there is so much for physicians to know and to learn that, unfortunately, in our view, environmental awareness is still not reaching the point of it becoming a mandatory part of the curriculum of physicians during their medical school training and exposure. And that's really unfortunate. I get back to what I said earlier about 80 to 90% of cancer is environmentally caused. 2/3 of the risk of autism are environmental exposures. Birth defects, poor fetal development, infertility. We mentioned the plummeting in sperm counts globally. All of this sort of thing has to be an environmental sort of trigger. And yet we're still not teaching physicians about it. Those like me who learned about it had to do it basically on our own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I dream of the day that medical school starts teaching the importance of diet in combination with environmental toxins. Eating clean food, what kinds of food, and so on, instead of just writing prescriptions to people to treat their symptoms. I wish that our medical community would go back to teaching diet and nutrition as prevention, as not only ways to treat conditions, but also to make it so that you don't develop all these issues, diabetes and cancer and neurological issues and whatever's going on with our community. It's both in the air and in our food. I really wish they would teach that.
If you go to an average grocery store, you're probably going to see 70 to 80% of the food there that is highly processed. And it'll be highly processed using soybeans and corn. Almost invariably, those soybeans and that corn will have been raised in big agricultural system of GMOs concomitantly with pesticides. So in addition to having a lot of the nutrition actually extracted in the highly processed manufacturing of that food, what you're also seeing is an addition of toxins, what we talked about, glyphosate in particular, but other kinds of pesticides. And we even know that things like, the most neurotoxic substance that we know of is mercury. Well, mercury is used in some of these processed foods, albeit in very small quantities, as a preservative, as it was in vaccines 25 years ago. Mercury has no role in our food supply, but the way high fructose corn syrup is made, the way a lot of highly processed foods are made from soybeans. Mercury is an end product. And if there's no safe exposure to lead, and we know that the CDC, the EPA, everyone recognized there's no safe amount of lead exposure because it affects the brain development. Mercury is probably 2 orders of magnitude more toxic to the brain on a per weight basis than lead is. And yet we allow big agricultural to create an entire system where things like mercury and all these other neurotoxins are baked into the process.
Huh. That's really interesting, Dr. Moench.
Wow.
Thanks for that wonderful answer. Shelly, thanks for calling in. Please make sure to check in next week at 4 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And I think we have 2 text questions for you. So, Dr. Moench, this is a question that I got a text on, but it's more of a overall question. So, how can we get involved with this fight for Utah health, and can we contact our representatives, and what should we ask them to do, and what should we ask our representatives for?
Well, I get back to our slogan of we educate, we advocate, and when necessary, we litigate. The public needs to help educate themselves. And that's one of the things that we try and do. We try and provide information like what I've talked about today on our website through op-eds that we submit to the newspaper. We try and do news stories to see if we can get TV stations to pick up news stories that are relevant. Whenever there's a significant breakthrough, if you will, in medical research and say things like air pollution, we try and publicize that. Like I think it was 2016, where first ever research shows that air pollution particles are embedded in everyone's brain. It was an autopsy study of 100 patients from different parts of the world, and the researchers found air pollution particles embedded in every single brain that they examined, even in infants. Well, that sort of study needs to be publicized. The public needs to know. So we held a press conference, and we had multiple TV stations that appeared at that press conference to help get the word out. So if the public is better educated on these issues, they're more likely to help protect themselves in their own behavior, as well as be more eager to contact their lawmakers and say, this particular public policy is a failure and you need to do something about it. Mm-hmm. So educating the public is, I think, the first step. You need to be willing to speak up to your neighbors, your friends, and your family about what you learn. You need to learn, I guess I'll get back to the idea, you need to learn 2 things: how to protect yourself and how to protect the community through better public policy. And if we're not getting anywhere, like we frequently aren't, then we need to take people to court. So that's where donating can come in and make a difference in terms of the overall community's exposure to these kinds of chemical toxins.
That is a wonderful answer. And that actually goes into the other text question I have of, so with helping our communities and talking to people and getting out there and spreading the word. So with our help with talking to our representatives, and now the actual next text question is, what town do you consider to be the most toxic that we need to then talk to our representatives about to help fix this toxicity?
Well, now that's a tough question. Part of our initial topic here was trying to dissect the increasingly significant health hazard of allowing the Great Salt Lake to disappear. Well, there are communities that are going to be at greater risk from that than others. And those that are immediately east of the Great Salt Lake are going to be the ones most affected. So Weber County, Davis County, and North Salt Lake, those people are going to be experiencing a greater hazardous burden than the rest of the people, at least from the Great Salt Lake's point of view. And I should mention that North Salt Lake also has the convergence of several other sorts of pollution sources. The convergence of the freeways, downwind of the refineries, the Kennecott tailing ponds, the ethylene oxide from Sterigenics, things like that. So there are communities that are at greatest risk, and at least in the Salt Lake Valley proper, the west side, we know from multiple studies actually, that the west side has a disproportionate burden in their exposure to various pollutions. So if we're talking about the Great Salt Lake and what the health consequences are going to be going forward, those communities are going to be disproportionately affected.
Dr. Brian, I have two couple questions on that. One, are there, as far as like banners and signs that people can put up in their yard, have you been doing anything? I mean, can neighbors help out by just even having stuff like that? Do you have something ready to go if we wanted to get those made for you, and then just start talking to people about putting them in their yard?
That's a great, again, I want whoever's listening to know that Laurie and I didn't orchestrate this. But as a matter of fact, we do. We have a yard sign that says, ask your doctor if clean air is right for you. You know, we're playing off this incessant litany of ads from pharmaceutical companies about ask your doctor if whatever drug is right for you. Well, our slogan is ask your doctor if clean air is right for you. And so we have a yard sign, and I'd love to see thousands of those yard signs scattered throughout our major metropolitan areas.
How do we get a hold of those signs?
Contact our website.
Okay.
You know, you don't really even have to donate to get that, but if you want to make a donation of a few bucks to get one, that's all the better.
What's the website again, doctor? Please, one more time.
uphe.org. That's the acronym for Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment.
Thank you.
And I will say, even though the slogan obviously only addresses air quality, if you help people understand that here's an area where we need to improve, then they're more likely to be receptive to the idea, well, there are other areas where we need to improve as well. We need to protect our water quality. We need to reduce our exposure to various sources of chemicals, like through consumer products. How many people know that there's a very toxic chemical in things like candles? Probably hardly anybody. But every time you light up a scented candle, you're exposing you're exposing your family in your house to a toxic group of chemicals called phthalates. If something has, unfortunately, a pleasant aroma, it's almost certainly from a chemical group called phthalates, and they're toxic.
Well, there are some safe candles. There are always better choices.
Right. Well, yeah, I'm sure there are, but the average candle, the average person purchases is whatever that scented is more than likely to be phthalates.
Yes.
Right.
Well,
agreed on that.
There are things like we now know how toxic the forever chemicals are, the PFAS group. There's no safe level of exposure to that. And how many of us are still using nonstick cookware that's coated with that stuff?
Not me.
Not me.
But many people are.
Well, and let me just get back to pesticides for just a second and PFAS contamination. The state of Maine analyzed thousands of pesticides for contamination with PFAS chemicals, and they found 1,400 of the pesticides that they tested were contaminated with PFAS chemicals. Now, as we talked about earlier, pesticides are toxic enough in and of themselves. But if on top of that you add PFAS chemicals, that makes it absolutely horrendous. And when the EPA comes out and says, basically there's no safe level of exposure to PFAS chemicals, and yet they're almost embedded in thousands of consumer products, including your cookware, including dental floss, including rain gear, blah, 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 blah. And then you think, well, all these pesticides that are being sprayed in Mill Creek Canyon against the Phragmites of the Great Salt Lake, against the mosquitoes around the Great Salt Lake, are likely also contaminated with PFAS chemicals. That just ratchets up the danger all that much more.
Wow. My head is spinning right now.
I know.
Jessica, you've been pretty quiet. I have a feeling that your head's spinning because you have a
Yeah.
newborn granddaughter.
Yeah, I have a 2-day-old newborn granddaughter.
Oh, congratulations.
And so, that you're talking
Congratulations.
about, I'm just thinking, well, thank God her mom and her dad are aware of these things, and they've done what they can to mitigate the dangers and the exposures to her. But still, like, I just keep on imagining this beautiful newborn baby, who's bonding with her mom through breastfeeding, but the possibility of these contaminants crossing through in the breast milk. And it's so disheartening. And thinking about these children are our future. These are our future generations that are going to be taking over the world, taking care of the earth when we are no longer here, because we're aging.
I just lost it, I think.
What does that look like for them?
Well, I hate to bombard people with such bad news. I wish I had some really good news, but in response to what Jessica just mentioned, I get back to the issue of, unfortunately, newborn babies are born pre-polluted.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a fact of life. There is not a single chemical of the hundreds that cross the placenta into the umbilical cord that is enhancing organ development of that baby. Not a single one. But we also know many of them are also carcinogens, teratogens, immunosuppressants, and neurotoxins. And many of these things have multiple effects at the same time. So I think what you just described, Jessica, just amplifies the issue. This is a moral imperative for us to clean up the environment that children can be safe in, that newborns can be born in, and that future generations can be safer. One of the things we haven't talked about is the impact on DNA of these sorts of toxins. We know that it impacts DNA. We know that can be passed on to subsequent generations, to the point where these environmental toxins are not just affecting people now, they're impacting and degrading the health of people who haven't even been born yet. Not only haven't been born yet, but people whose parents are a generation or two from conceiving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and that it goes back to critical thinking too, right? Thinking about critically, what is this that I'm getting ready to spray on my lawn? What is this that I'm getting ready to expose everybody else to? Like, thinking long term with thinking about the ripple effect is what I like to call it, with whatever decision we're making. Every decision that we make has a ripple effect. And how is that ripple that we want to leave? Like, what is that we want to leave?
Like, getting rid of the dandelions in your front yard, is that really that important that you need to bring toxins into your yard to get rid of those dandelions? It's a value system that we have adopted at the urging of corporations that make those kinds of herbicides.
I want to pitch in here. There are better choices. You can make better choices. There are still things you can treat your dandelions with if you wish, but there's always the boiling water in the tea kettle too. And, a nice tool to get down to the root and dig them out. I happen to sell a non-toxic bioherbicide because I'm very concerned about people's use of glyphosate. But the thing to remember about these chemicals is that a lot of the science that, say, industry proponents or supporters of chemicals like Roundup will say, they'll use this old expression called the dose makes the poison. And what they mean by that is for you to believe that it's safe because only a tiny bit of exposure won't hurt you. It's only if you're exposed to a truckload that you will get hurt. That's true. You will get hurt if you are exposed to a truckload, But the part that old science ignores is the endocrinology, which is what you were talking about, doctor, about effects now, exposures now, even to tiny amounts of these chemicals will affect your great, great, great grandchildren. And nothing may even show up until that great, great, great grandchild is born. But what we are exposed to now will affect us later, and also in tiny amounts. The effect is just different.
Well, the Endocrine Society, which is the world's body of experts on endocrine diseases, and that means diseases related to the adrenal glands, the thyroid, the pancreas, and so forth. They came out with a statement in 2009. I wish I had it at my fingertips. Essentially, what you just described, infinitesimally small levels of exposure to endocrine disruptors can have lifelong impacts, can have multiple generation impacts. I'll give you one example. Let's take any sort of exposure, air pollution, for example. You have a pregnant mother who breathes in some air pollution, her health is affected. The fetus's health is affected. If the fetus is a female, her eggs are also developing as well. So one exposure right there can affect the health of 3 generations. And we have studies in invertebrates that show the impact on chromosomes from environmental toxins can last through 11 generations. So we have a saying that's with regard to air pollution, you are what your grandparents inhaled. Your grandchildren will be what you inhaled. Well, that concept applies not just to air pollution, but all kinds of environmental exposures. But one of the things that's really frustrating is 27 years ago, the EPA was ordered to test pesticides for their endocrine disrupting capability. It never happened. They were ordered again to take their 17 most commonly used pesticides and test them for endocrine disrupting capability, and they still didn't do it, and they're not doing it now. And that's one of the reasons why, as a group, these pesticides are as hazardous as they are, is because most of them are endocrine disruptors.
So, Dr. Brian, as we wrap up, how would you like to wrap up? What is your thought? And I want to ask one final question on my part, and not that it's a political question, but we're involved on the political side, governor, senator, and I know that Dr. Mike Kennedy is running for a senator, and he is a doctor. He is also seeing this. But for my question, and then your final wrap-up question, I've been talking to people like Phil Lyman, who's running for governor, Dr. Mike Kennedy, Frank Mylar, who's running for AG, about the issue that you are battling. And I'm getting really good comments of interest for them. So with that said, for what we're trying to do out there in the new campaigns, what is one thing that you can say to that, and how would you like then to wrap up your call with what you are doing to fight this cause?
Well, our nonprofit is not allowed to endorse any candidates, so I won't and I can't.
Yeah, correct.
But
Could you tell me that I could pass out?
Well, what I would say is, whoever you're going to vote for, I would like you to prioritize their understanding and appreciation of the science behind all the things that we talked about. That we cannot rely simply on the pressure of businesses and corporations to wield whatever sort of public policy they do, because they have contributions that they campaign contributions that they can hand out. They all too often just get their way for that reason. Politicians are too eager to listen to whoever will give them money. And, that's a depressing fact of life.
Agreed.
But we need to make sure that people understand there is real solid science behind the observations that we've talked about, behind the threats that we've tried to detail, and there are real personal consequences. I mentioned the rates of cancer in my neighborhood. I didn't mention that 7 of my 12 closest relatives, meaning my children and my siblings, have had cancer, and me twice. So if you don't think that this affects you, go look in the mirror. Go look at your family photos. There are lives that are being ended and disrupted and compromised and endangered because we don't do anywhere near enough in protecting our environment. And whoever you vote for, if you prioritize what their views are on protecting the environment, you're also going to help protect yourself.
Thank you for that. And what's your final comment for the listeners and listeners who will be listening in the future to this most important podcast we've done with you today?
Well, so much of what I've had to say is a downer. It's depressing. In many cases, it's terrifying. I don't want people to go away from this thinking that, this is a horrible situation. There's nothing we can do. There's a lot that you can do. I don't want people to get discouraged, but I want them to get motivated to start improving their own risks, their own health, and their own lives. And like I said, there are 2 important ways to do that. Protect yourself. Do the things that you can individually do to reduce your overall risk. But at the same time, get engaged in the public process so that the entire community has less exposure, because there's no way that we're not all exposed to what the community is. So there's a limit to what you can do to protect yourself. Beyond that, the community has to do better, but you can play an important role in both.
I just want to share on that in my city of Irvine, California, I got a group together, and in 2016, we went to our city council and our school district, and we got the city to adopt an organics first policy. They don't use any toxic fertilizers or pesticides around our parks or on any city properties. We are a good sized city. And I just want to tell people that if you get a hold of us here or get a hold of the doctor, or you can go to nontoxiccommunities.com, you can make change in your community. And I want to encourage everyone to do that. Take this information and ask for positive change from your council members.
Well, absolutely. And I will just add that the physicians group that I represent now, that I'm the co-founder of and the president, that's exactly what we did. We recognized that the medical community was not engaged in this issue and that they needed to be engaged. So there are things that every single one of you out there can do, both for the benefit of you personally and the benefit of the community at large. So don't get discouraged despite all the terrifying things that we've talked about. Make that a determination on your part to make it better.
Yep.
I like that. It's really have the courage and take a step and move it forward.
Thank you, Doctor.
So thank you, Dr. Brian Moench. We really appreciate it. We need to spread the good word. Jessica would love to put his site on our website and Facebook, and we will get this video out there and also to the people that matter. So thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate your courage of standing up. We know the fight is hard. We've been fighting it and we know what it takes. And again, for any of the listeners out there, Any donation matters. If it's $5 or $10, it costs money for Dr. Brian and his group to do the fight. And without contributions from honestly each and every one of us, it's hard to continue the fight. So please take a look at uphe.org. Educate yourself, hit that donate button. Any amount matters. And so thank you, Dr. Brian. We really appreciate your time. Thank you, my lovely colleagues and co-hosts. And I wish everyone a good evening. And Doctor, again, thank you so much for what you're doing.
Thanks for having me.
All righty. Thank you. Good night.